Welcome to our podcast for college Catholics, where we discuss faith and spirituality from a Catholic perspective. I'm Father Patrick. First of all, for all those who are listening to this episode during the last week of November 2024, Happy Thanksgiving. I think it's a great moment to renew our appreciation and our gratitude for all the many gifts we have received from God, particularly the gift of life and the gift of the Catholic faith. And for me, it's a great opportunity as well to give thanks for this continuing podcast for college Catholics, which has been in existence now for 2 and more than a half years, coming out on a weekly basis. I want to give thanks to Midas Christi, to my superiors, and my religious community. I would also like to thank all those who have helped me getting this podcast going. In that sense, I want to give a shout out to Lori, to Kim, to Jeff, to Ben, and to Victor, who actually helped with their support to start up this podcast with the technology and the hardware that I'm using. And a big shout out to Daniel, to Ella, to Brother Francis, to Jenny, and several others who have told me that they habitually listen to every episode that I put out. And thank you to all of you who are listening. I am truly thankful for tuning in. In our last episode, we started speaking about the Fifth Commandment, thou shalt not kill. So here's a quick recap of what I said. I explained how this commandment forbids, first of all, the killing of innocent human beings from the moment of conception until natural death. I also explained how that does not negate the right of an individual person, as well as the right of societies to defend themselves against an unjust aggressor who threatens their life, or the lives of people who are under one's authority and responsibility. We also spoke about how direct, procured abortion is one of the most terrible ways of killing an innocent person, because the child in the womb is completely defenseless and entrusted to the mother's care for his survival. So this makes abortion particularly grievous. So abortion, that is the direct, intentional destruction of an embryo or fetus in the mother's womb, is always a grave sin. And this doctrine has been part of the Church's teaching from the time of the Apostles until today, and it is unchangeable. Now, deeply related to the dignity and the respect that we owe to the human person, even in the womb, and even if it is as tiny as an embryo in its initial development, is the fact that any research that leads to the manipulation, the damaging, or the destruction of human embryos is, of course, immoral, even if the entire humanity might benefit from it. So benefiting the health of 1 billion people does not justify the destruction of one human embryo or unborn baby. A human embryo is a human being, a human person, created in the image and likeness of God, just as the unborn child or any living person. And it has the right to come into being naturally, as God intended it. And it has the right also to grow and develop in a natural way in its natural place of development, which is its own mother's womb. This is one of the reasons why in vitro fertilization, or IVF, is immoral or sinful. Now, infertility is a painful cross that many couples have to carry. Whenever I celebrate a marriage, I always pray for the couple that they may have many children. Now, I have seen several cases where, through prayer to the Virgin Mary and to the saints, God has granted children to couples who were infertile. However, this does not always happen, and there's a lot of scientific research to help, in some cases, infertile couples to conceive children. However, not every scientific research is morally licit, and not every technique to overcome infertility is morally acceptable. There are many things that researchers do and many infertility techniques that are against the law of God, and sometimes gravely sinful. To clarify some of these things, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Church, led by Cardinal Ratzinger in that time, wrote a document in 1987 called donum vitae, or in English, the gift of life, which I encourage you to read and for which I will put a link in the show notes below. The basic principle taught by the Church in Donum Vitae is that if a given medical intervention helps or assists the marriage act or the marital act to achieve pregnancy, it may be considered moral or licit. However, if the intervention replaces the marriage act or marital act in order to engender life, it is not moral. It is not blessed by God. One of those techniques that is not morally acceptable is IVF, which implies basically the fertilization of several of the woman's eggs with sperm from the husband in a laboratory dish or petri dish to produce several embryos which are given some time to develop in the lab. Some of those embryos may be discarded or destroyed. Others may be frozen or used for medical experimentation and research. And several others are finally implanted in the mother's womb, hoping that one or more will survive and then develop into the child that is desired. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, if several babies start to develop in the mother's womb, but the mother wanted only one or maybe two, then the rest might be simply aborted. So you can see how IVF replaces the marital act and causes life to be produced in a laboratory environment. This is why IVF children were at one point called test tube babies. The embryos produced are human embryos, and the children born are human babies, and therefore we owe them all the respect and equal love as any other human being. Now, other reasons why IVF is immoral is because sometimes the egg or the sperm used might not be from the father or the mother, but obtained from a donor, that is, someone outside the marriage, a third biological parent, whose identity sometimes might not be known and might be never be known. In a similar way, it is immoral to produce human beings through cloning, if that were to become possible, which is a complex procedure that clearly replaces the marital act and the natural God-intended way to bring about human life into this world. Cloned children would really not have a father or a mother, but they would be a human being produced by technology. The document Donum Vitae says in number 6, attempts or hypotheses for obtaining human being without any connection with sexuality through twin fission, cloning, or parthenogenesis are to be considered contrary to the moral law, since they are in opposition to the dignity both of human procreation and of the conjugal union. The most grievous sin related to cloning is when human embryos are produced to become material for research or for harvesting human parts or organs in order to help other human beings who are alive but need organ transplants. Of course, this might be presented as a great advancement of science, but it would be a monstrosity and gravely contrary to the law of God and the dignity of the human person. There are other morally acceptable scientific procedures to do research and to help couples that are struggling with infertility, but I will leave that for some future episode. So let us continue with the Fifth Commandment. On the other spectrum of the human life, or the other end of the spectrum in the human life, we should address the topic of the end of life. In this sense, it is gravely sinful to commit suicide, or help someone commit suicide, or cause someone to commit suicide. This might be evident, but there are times where some comments or some expressions of bullying, whether in high school or in college, that people say lightly, but they might lead the other person to take their own lives. I heard more than once about the case of someone telling another person, or maybe writing in a text or social media, telling another person, why don't you kill yourself? And it is not rare that the person receiving those remarks would consider seriously committing suicide. And this is terrible. Now, in that case, the person who said that or wrote that social media text or message is partially responsible of any attempt of the other person of taking their own life. And this is very serious as well, or grave. I also spoke about the sin of scandal, which is the attitude or an attitude, any word, any action or behavior which leads another person to sin. Many people underestimate the negative power of their words and attitudes. Scandal comes from a Greek word, skandalon, which means stumbling block. In that sense, a scandal can be any publicly sinful action, any bad advice, any sexually provocative social media post, any invitation to indecent shows or actions, dressing or dancing immodestly, any laws, any fashions, any social pressure or bullying that can lead another person to sin. In that sense, governors, public officials, influencers, priests, celebrities, and any other person with public or social renown must take very seriously how they live, the way that they live, and the laws they enforce, and the things that they say and do, because it has an impact on many, many people. Another area where this commandment has some consequences is the respect for our health. We have to reasonably provide for our own health and the health of those under our responsibility, and to the extent that we can, the health of our neighbor. However, on the other hand, the health of the body is not an absolute value. That is, this commandment, and here I'm quoting the Catechism, rejects the neo-pagan notion that tends to promote the cult of the body, to sacrifice everything for its sake, to idolize physical perfection and success at sports. By its selective preference of the strong over the weak, such a conception can lead to the perversion of human relationships. So up to there, the Catechism. Now, in that sense, it is clear that those sports in which the risk of losing one's life is immediate and imminent at every moment for the sake of entertainment or competition can be also seriously sinful. The abuse of alcohol, medications, tobacco, or food can reach the point of being gravely sinful as well, especially if it puts our life or the lives of others at risk. There is no doubt in that sense that driving while being seriously intoxicated is a grave sin. Now, regarding the use of drugs, the Church states that it is a mortal sin unless it is for strictly medical reasons, and I would add, under the supervision of a doctor, to use drugs. Here's what the Catechism says. The use of drugs inflicts very grave damage on human health and life. Their use, except on strictly therapeutic grounds, is a grave offense. For that same reason, the production or trafficking of drugs is gravely sinful as well, as it is a direct cooperation with evil. Now, on another note, prudent scientific research to encourage the health of the public is good as long as it is morally acceptable and it leads to the healing of the sick. In that sense, it is as an expression of man's dominion over creation. However, obviously, I say obviously, but not so obvious to many people, but not all scientific research is morally licit. In that sense, scientific research has to be conducted according to the law of God and respect always the integrity and dignity of the human persons and the human being and of creation. The potentially helpful results of scientific experimentation does not validate any human experimentation whatsoever. For example, Scientific experimentation that exposes the person's life or physical or psychological integrity to illness or death cannot be morally acceptable, even if the person had given their consent, and even if billions of people were to benefit from that experimentation. The Fifth Commandment also forbids the unnecessary mutilation of human beings, as what is sometimes nowadays done for supposed sex identity surgeries. On the other hand, organ donation can be acceptable and even virtuous in some situations, especially if the organs donated are not necessary for the life of the person, and the benefits of the recipient are proportional to the sacrifice of the donor. Now, absolutely no one should feel pressured by anyone else to make an organ donation. Now, on the other hand, organ donation is not licit if the person has not given their consent, and it is not morally acceptable if the organ donation brings about the disabling mutilation or the death of the donor. So there's a whole other area of sins related to bodily integrity of individuals in society. In that sense, I will summarize a little bit, but kidnapping, taking hostages, terrorism, torture, imposed famines, imposed sterilizations, mutilations, and indiscriminate killing of civilians in war are all sins against the Fifth Commandment. Now, nowadays, given the power of the weapons in our day and age, war can bring about very serious lethal consequences to entire societies and countries. And therefore, we should do everything we can to avoid unnecessary armed conflicts. However, of course, just as personal self-defense against an unjust aggressor is licit, so too it is possible to consider licit the defense of our country against an unjust aggressor. However, this is not something to be simply recognized as morally acceptable without serious conditions. This is why the Church explains that not any armed conflict in defense of one's country is legitimate before God. These are some of the principles within the Church's just war teachings. There are serious conditions that have to be met when a country considers defending oneself against another country's attack. So here's a summary of the Church's just war theory or teaching. First of all, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. At the same time, all other means of putting an end to that aggression must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. Besides, there must be serious or sure prospects of success. That is, the armed conflict that will come about will bring peace and defend the sovereignty and the population of the country that was attacked. And finally, the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. Because the power of the modern means of destruction, particularly atomic bombs, weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. And what this means in this sense, it means that the final cost of life and destruction of that armed defense cannot end up being worse than if the attacking country were allowed to have its way. And this is sometimes tricky, but it's important to have it in mind. We must keep in mind these conditions, right, for a just war before lightly considering the possibility of an armed conflict. So these are the traditional elements enumerated in what is called the just war teaching or doctrine in the Catholic Church. Well, that is a rough topic of discussion, of course, for this week. It's difficult to talk about all these things, and we wish we didn't have to speak about them. We sometimes wish we could live in a world where all these evils would disappear. But that will only be possible when and if the whole world embraces Jesus Christ, His gospel, and His church. This is why we have to continue to strive for holiness and continue to try our best to bring others to embrace the life-giving teachings of Jesus Christ and the gospel. So that is all for today. In the show notes below, I have left some links to the documents discussed today. Also, I wish you all a blessed beginning of the season of Advent, as we're just very close to the first Sunday in Advent. And this is the preparation for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and the feast of Christmas. Thank you very much for listening, and please share this episode with your friends. And if you can, leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Now, you can also find us on YouTube, so make sure you leave some comments there as well. I hope to see you next time. May God bless your day.